Hey, I want to tell this story about sort of the different ways people think about storytelling. And I'm going to use an example recently from my job, my somewhat limited effectiveness, but very interesting job as a consultant for the WWE, which I've been doing for almost 2 years now. So I was backstage, and I'd met all the writers who are all really sweet, smart guys, and I was hanging out with Ed Koskey, who's the head writer of Raw and SmackDown, who's brilliant and so funny and so smart and really interesting dude. And Seth Rollins came up to us, and of course I'm Mark, so I was like, holy shit, Tyler Black. I was like, this guy. If you don't watch wrestling, this is one of the best wrestlers in the world. And probably in the top 30 best wrestlers ever in history. He's incredibly entertaining to watch. He's a fun character, but I was excited to meet him. But I work at the company, so I played it relatively cool. Um, and I said to him what I'd already been saying to Ed, which is one of the things I always say about the show, and I say this about the show all the time publicly too, is that wrestling works best when it's written like a TV show. And it works less effectively when everything is very separate from each other and it feels like a series of vignettes or a three-ring circus. Because that's wrestling's roots, was at Carney, it's Carney stuff. The midgets would have the midget match, and then the big guys would have the big guy match, and then the fast guys would have the fast guy match. And that was fine then. But when it's a TV show, it helps if it feels like there's a lot of crossover. And really what the Attitude Era, the golden age of wrestling writing, did so well is it felt like anyone could wander into any storyline. Kind of like on Game of Thrones. Things are really separate until they suddenly aren't. So I said to Seth, the Cruiserweight division, which is part of wrestling, part of the show, where fast guys fight, I guess is the best way to describe it, feels very separate from the rest of the show. So that makes it feel less consequential and makes the show feel less cohesive as a whole. And I said that to Seth, and Seth was like, well, yeah, but, how would you integrate? And I said, well, Braun Strowman, who's this giant monster guy, he's at odds with the management of the show. As a statement, have him come out and attack two cruiserweights during their match. And basically attack them, beat them up, get a mic and say, I'm not going to take any of this shit anymore, except for then the two cruiserweights, these little fast guys, come back in, and even though they were having a match before, they dump him from the ring. Braun Strowman is pissed off because it was 2-on-1, and he's like, this isn't fair, fuck this. He leaves. And Seth immediately said, well, who does that get over? Like, in wrestling, the way a lot of people who work within it think of it is basically like it's almost real. It's the idea that certain guys need to be protected to add stakes to their matches. And that's true. But what's interesting is it immediately showed the difference between the way I, as a more traditional writer, think about the show and the way Seth, who's, one of the best in the world in wrestling, thinks about wrestling. Because it's two different mentalities. Because I'm not trying to get any one of those guys over. I'm trying to narratively introduce the idea that that could happen. Because otherwise, it kind of feels like they're all on different shows. And because he dumps two guys at once and it takes both of them fighting him together to get him to leave, everyone ends up kind of even Stevens. And the question is, what happens next? Rather than, oh, he beat them up and they leave. But of course, I didn't say that to Seth, who rightly, because in a wrestling mindset, he's also correct. What is the forward movement from there? Rightly took issue with it. And it's fascinating because it brings up the sort of lyrical nature of the performance art nature of wrestling versus the way I was pitching, like it's a TV show. And both work. Neither Seth nor I was wrong. I didn't defend myself because it was fucking Seth Rollins, but I kind of in my head was like, yeah, but I'm not trying to get a person over. I'm trying to get a situation over. And once that mechanism of, hey, Braun Strowman can walk into anyone's match and cause trouble has been introduced, suddenly you have an entire new venue of storytelling. Stories are about threads. And the best way to tell a story is the subtle introduction of hundreds of threads. It's so subtle you don't even notice them. I mean, when you were introduced in Empire Strikes Back to all those bounty hunters, there's not much to tell you Boba Fett's the one to watch. And yet there are now comics and toys of all of those bounty hunters. I like to introduce threads. A wrestler is more focused on tying threads together because they're trying to figure out what the next match is. Who's going over? Who's hot right now? Who's a face, who's a heel? What's the heat on this person, and what's their narrative direction? And how can that narrative direction make them look tough? And I found that fucking fascinating because as a writer, my goal is to get over the world. And as a wrestler, your goal is to get over the competition. And that's super interesting. And I hope you found that interesting too.